Hi, we're talking about container gardening today. Should be a lot of fun. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. And okay, here we go.
Yeah.
My name is Brendan Wills. I'm the Conservation Program Coordinator for CNPS. I've been with the Native Plant Society for about 2.5 years now. My background is in horticulture. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Horticulture out of UC Davis. And then my first career was as a grower and manager at a small nursery in the Sierra Nevada foothills, which I enjoyed for several years before joining CNPS. I've been collecting and growing plants in containers for about 20 years now. My cactus and succulents, I think, were what first really got me into collecting plants, and then I have moved on to carnivorous plants. For a while, I had a particular interest in species maples and rhododendrons. A lot of plants in the nursery trade are hybrids, and I just find the wild types really special. And then clearly have a passion for native plants, which dominate the bulk of my collection now. And I've got quite a few native plant containers and in-ground native plant garden as well. And growing plants in containers has a lot of advantages, especially for us with limited space and those of us who plan on moving and taking our plants along with it. But there are also quite a few challenges that come along with growing in containers. We have a fairly unnatural environment, and California native plants in general, they're definitely riparian plants used to year-round water, but a lot of our flora is used to staying dry during the summer months. But unfortunately, in containers, we need to water to keep them alive through the summer, and there are definitely some challenges that go along with getting plants that want to be dry wet. But there are definitely a few techniques to kind of balance that. Balance the needs of the plants. And then we're also dealing with limited root space, which means also limited space for nutrients to live. So we just need to keep up with inputs, and then create a controlled habitat where our plants can survive and thrive despite the challenges of living with limited root space, limited access to water and nutrients. Today we're going to cover quite a few topics. We'll talk a bit about containers. I'm going to spend a pretty good amount of time talking about soils and what types of soils make gardening in container a little bit easier for us. Talk a little bit about inputs, fertilizers, and other supplements that we can add to keep our plants happy. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about watering, how to get plants through the heat of summer without causing root rot and other disease issues that we often run into on plants that don't like wet feet. Talk briefly about maintenance of plants. Lots of different species and lots of different types, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because it's really going to be specific to the type of plant that you're growing. And then we're going to go through a few of our personal favorite container plants, and then we're hoping to leave a pretty good amount of time at the end of the presentation so we can answer your questions and talk about some of the plants that you all are interested in growing in containers, and potentially coming up with some solutions for problems that people may have had with container gardening in the past. So this should be a lot of fun. Container gardening is great, and with just a few tips, we can make this successful for everyone who is growing our natives as patio or container plants. For containers, really any pot will do. It's really just a matter of finding the right plant for the container that you have, and then coming up with an appropriate planting mix to be sure that that plant is happy in that container. We always prefer pots with drain holes, but if you find a container that you love that does not have a drain hole, can either drill it out to create a drain hole, and using cache pots is great too. So undrained pots can be used as a cache pot, and we basically just slide a regular plastic nursery pot of the appropriate size into your container. You can do this with undrained pots too, and I actually do this a lot on my patio. A lot of our natives have seasons where they look really good and seasons where they don't. Bulbs are a great example of this, which go dormant in the summer. And with a cache pot, you can just rotate what looks good into a prime spot on your patio and then tuck it away in a less of a less of a centerpiece, as they're not looking quite as good. So yeah.
Oh, really quick, what is a cache pot?
So a cache pot is just basically, it can be a drained or undrained pot, but it is just a pot that you hide another pot inside of. Um, and so yeah, great way to rotate plants. If you have one nice container that works as a centerpiece, this is a way that you can seasonally rotate plants that look good into it. And also, yeah, a great way to, like I said, always have a nice centerpiece. And again, this can be drained or undrained, just a pot inside a pot. And actually in hot summer climates, cache pot can be great because it keeps the sun from beating on the sides of the pot that your plant is actually in. So few advantages to using cache pots. So container can really go any way you want, but then we need to put soil into that container. And in general, native plants prefer a well-draining potting soil that provides a good amount of air circulation around the roots. And from my experience, I've found that if you're going to be using a pre-bagged mix as opposed to sort of blending your own soil, a cactus or citrus potting mix tend to be best for most natives. They tend to drain a little bit more quickly. And then we're going to talk a bit about how soils break down and decompose as they age, and how this affects the longevity of a container planting. And a lot of cactus and citrus mix tend to have more pumice or lava or sand in them, and all of those components break down less quickly and add some longevity to the soil in the container. So as I was saying, a lot of pots or a lot of bag mixes may not last a super long time in a container. They tend to be designed to last about a year in a pot, and they do start to break down fairly quickly. And this is great for annuals or other plant containers that you plan to replant or refresh the soil fairly regularly. But if you have a container planting that you are not intending on refreshing the soil or completely replanting each season, it's best to use a soil that has more inorganic components, lava rock, pumice, sand, etc. And again, the compost and peat based soils tend to break down fairly quickly. They'll start to compact and lose their ability to hold on to soil nutrients and moisture. So if we are going to use a pre-bag mix, like I said, I normally recommend a citrus or cactus blend, but it's great to also mix your own blend. These tend to last longer. And then also the added airspace that we get from adding the pumice, perlite, or crushed lava will help us be able to irrigate the pots through the summer without them staying sopping wet, and sort of this mitigates that issue of having plants that want to stay dry but needing to water them. So here are just sort of some general examples of soil blends that I like to use. I normally use what I call my standard blend, and it's 1 part potting soil. I normally use, even when I'm mixing it with other stuff, start with that cactus and citrus mix. And then for my standard blend, I do 1 part pumice, 1 part crushed lava, and 1 part potting soil. Most of these ingredients are pretty easy to find, are fairly economical, and this can last for several years without having to refresh the soil. obviously, depending on what plants you're growing, that can be a big factor too. One drawback to this blend is that it gets very heavy with all the pumice and lava, and especially for large containers. It can make them very challenging to move around, but this is a great mix generally for most native plants, and I would recommend this for most container sizes other than the smallest pots. I would say something smaller than about a pint, you might want to use something different like the premium blend or my lightweight blend with a smaller grained perlite, and it could be a good option too. The lightweight blend is great. Potting soil and perlite are both pretty economical and pretty easy to find. The perlite will break down a little bit more quickly than pumice or crushed lava, but it's going to be a lot lighter weight. And it's a great mix for most containers. The perlite, being a little bit more porous, will break down a little bit more quickly than the pumice and lava rock, but will still last for several years in a container before you need to replant it. And then my premium blend is basically a bonsai soil. This is great for those really special plants that you do not want to lose. Plants just really seem to thrive in this mix, and it is also great for smaller containers, your bonsai pots, your teacup sized containers, things like that. It seems to be a really good mix. Drawback is that a lot of the components can be a little bit harder to track down. You might have to go to a specialty nursery or to a mail order source to get these, and then also the calcined clay and expanded shale products can be fairly expensive. The calcined clay is what is typically used in as a main component in a bonsai mix. There's a product called Akadama, which comes out of Japan, and it comes in a hard-fired and a less high temperature fired form, and I would always recommend getting the higher fired products. They're going to last a lot longer in the containers. They don't break down nearly as quickly. For calcined clay, Akadama is one product that's available, and then there's another product called Bonsai Block, which is a US made fired clay product, and it's really good quality calcined clay product that will last a while. And expanded shale is great too, but it can be pretty hard to find. There's not very many sources for it. And then mixing that with 1 part pumice, 1 part crushed lava. And then I like to add a little bit of biochar, which is good, retains a little bit of moisture, and then also provides a place for some of the beneficial soil microbes to hang out. So yeah, a lot of times I use this mix I like to use it for my bulbs. I like to use it for a lot of the buckwheats that I grow in smaller containers, but there are a few basic blends. And like I said, especially if you're just getting started and don't want to go to the trouble, just a bag cactus and mix will be great and will typically last at least a couple years before you'll need to repot it.
Sorry, really quickly
Yeah,
before we
definitely.
dive into fertilizers, we had some questions about you're going to be talking about refreshing soil, right? Later on.
I'm gonna talk briefly
Okay.
on that in maintenance, but I would
Oh
be
yeah.
happy
Okay, we'll
to,
save it. Yeah,
okay.
and then also really quickly, what about if you have a really large container and you don't necessarily want to fill all of it with a potting mix? Do you recommend any fillers like, stones or logs or anything if you have a really large container that you're working with?
That is a fabulous question. And really anything can work. I've seen people use all sorts of different techniques to sort of fill the bottom of the pot. Rocks are great, but drawback there is that they make the pot very heavy again. It is maybe not the most environmentally friendly option, but if you end up with extra styrofoam packing peanuts, be sure that they're not the new cornstarch based ones, but you can actually toss them into a plastic bag, toss that in the container, and then fill the soil above that. And then you can just put the peanuts directly in and then layer a piece of like weed block fabric or other porous material on top of that to allow the moisture to flow through. And then you could even, something like the perlite is really lightweight and pretty economical. You could just fill the bottom of the pot with perlite and then fill soil above that. And I will mention real quickly, since we're on soils and containers, before we move on, that I always like to put a piece of like metal screen, like a hardware cloth or something like that, over the drain hole in the bottom of the pot. That helps keep soil from washing into it and helps keep it getting blocked up, which is a challenge. And we'll talk briefly on that when we get to maintenance and repotting and issues with watering also.
Great, thank you. And what is your source of soil mix that you use?
Normally just yeah, good question. Any local independent garden center is a great place to get your potting soil, your perlite, and your pumice. Your nursery may or may not carry crushed lava. So I typically get mine from a local rock yard. They have, it's not quite as small as I'd like it, but they have a 5/16 grade crushed lava, which is a great size for most larger containers. And then if you have a local bonsai nursery, they will often have pumice, crushed lava, and as well as the calcined clay products. And nice thing there is they often will carry a variety of sizes, so you can use like a 1/8 inch for your smaller pots, and use a 1/4 inch or 5/16 for your larger containers. And then I will mention one online source. They're called Bonsai Jack. They sell the bonsai block product that I talked about, and they're great. They can actually put together, if you create your own blend, they can pre-blend it for you. So instead of getting 4 different bags of little stuff, they'll just blend it at whatever ratios you want and ship it out that way. It's a little bit pricey, but Bonsai Jack is a good resource for really good quality, long-lasting soils. And again, great for your smaller containers or succulents. Some of the ferns that like to live in crevices and things like that also perform really well in that premium soil.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So in containers, native plants will need to be fed fairly regularly, and what fairly regularly will depend on a lot of things, the type of plant, the type of food that you're using, and then also the climate that you're gardening in, and when the plants are actively growing. But in pots, we clearly have limited space to hold nutrients, and having to water regularly, it tends to flush these nutrients out of the soil a little bit more quickly. So we do need to keep up with feeding our plants. So there are 3 basic types of fertilizers. Going to be your organic slow release top dresses. These are going to be products like your Dr. Earth or your EB Stone, a few other good brands out there. These typically last about 2 months in the soil. And advantage to these is that they are a good organic option. A lot of times they already have beneficial soil microbes mixed in, but they do have the downside of attracting pests and potentially your pets as well. So unfortunately, in my backyard, I do not have good luck with organic fertilizers, because my dog likes to eat the fertilizer out of the container that I have put it in. And then we have also had issues with skunks and possums and things like that being interested in the fertilizer. So I really like the organic slow release, but depending on your situation and for example, my situation, it unfortunately does not work all that well. Conventional slow release fertilizers are great, other than being a non-organic option. You have a lot of options here. They can be formulated to release over typically between a 3 and 12-month period. So you can really dial the release of fertilizer for your climate, for the plant's growth period. And Osmocote Plus, Nutricote Total are both products that I have used in the past and have had really good luck with. It's great that you can dial the release of the fertilizer for your gardening needs. And also a lot of these will have a complete selection of the micronutrients, your iron, zinc, molybdenum, all of those sort of metal nutrients that plants also need that may not be found in all of your fertilizers.
Quick question,
Yeah.
where does worm casings fall on this chart?
Worm casings are a great, I would consider them to be more of a soil amendment than a fertilizer personally. They are a great home for all your soil microbes, and they do a great job providing a place for these microbes so they can supply nutrients to the plant. They're a great way to refresh your soil, and they definitely add some nutritional value. But I personally consider worm castings to be more of an amendment than a fertilizer. They definitely do provide some nutrients, but isn't going to be very balanced and not going to be not going to have a lot of the micronutrients that you need also. So last main type of fertilizer that I'm going to talk about are your liquid feed fertilizers, such as Maxi. Fish emulsion is a great classic fertilizer, and then there are a few other non-organic brands such as Schultz and Miracle Grow, and they are starting to have organic options too. Great thing about liquid feeds is they are really fast acting. The plants can absorb them very quickly. Can sometimes see improved greening and growth within even a few hours of applying a liquid feed, but they don't persist very long in the soil, and especially in a container, they tend to get washed out fairly quickly. So if you're just using a liquid feed, you may need to water as often as every watering or as far as every couple weeks when the plants are actively growing. What do I do? If it was a perfect world and I didn't have to worry about the wildlife and my dog, I would probably do an organic slow release, and then just occasionally supplement with a little bit of liquid feed to give them a little boost as needed. As it is, I mostly use either Osmocote or Nutricote because the animals tend to leave them alone. And then I typically prefer the shorter release so that I'm not feeding the plants during periods where they don't really need the food, but it can be really convenient to just put an 8 or 10-month release fertilizer out, and then you do it once a year and you are done. Timing of fertilizer, and I'm going to get to that question on full strength of fertilizer in the next slide here. We'll talk a little bit about timing of fertilizer, and then I'll get into that bit on the strength that we're going to use. So this is just a really generic sample fertilizing schedule for your warm season growing plants. So we don't need to feed in the dead of winter when things aren't really actively growing. And then where I am in the interior where we get very hot in the summer, I typically give the plants a little break from feeding during the hottest months. The more the plants are feeding, the more more water they're going to need. So I normally give them a little bit of a break during the heat of summer. But if your plants are actively growing, you may want to continue to support that and then feed year round. And then in higher elevation climates, we're going to start fertilizing a little bit later in the year and stop fertilizing a little bit earlier, just because the weather is cold. We mentioned that we were going to talk about the strength of fertilizers. I'll get to that at the end of this slide here. So a little bit more on timing. Just know your plants, know when they're growing. We have a lot of great cool season growing annuals in California. So if you're growing annuals, you're probably going to need to feed during the winter months. And then a lot of cool season growing perennials may need some winter feeding also. So keep an eye on your plants, and if they're growing, maybe give them a little boost with a little bit of food. And also just keeping an eye on your plants as they start to grow into active growth can give them a little boost of a liquid fertilizer to help wake them up. And then I like to give my plants a little bit of a boost of liquid feed fertilizer after a heat wave. So, I mean, we were up over 100 degrees for about 2 weeks here. And then as we got back down into the low 90s, I went through and gave a lot of my containers just a light dose of food just to sort of wake them back up and let them know that it's not time to totally shut down for the year yet. And then in terms of the strength of the fertilizer, I really think it depends on the type of plant that you're growing and how vigorous the plant is. If you're growing some larger growing, more vigorous perennials or some of the trees and shrubs, you may want to feed at the full recommended rate that's listed on the fertilizer. But for a lot of our more diminutive natives, and a lot of the succulents and just a lot of our smaller and slower growing plants, I would recommend probably doing a half or a quarter of the full recommended dose listed on the fertilizer packaging. But that's really where keeping an eye on our plants and sort of knowing your plants comes into play. If you know you've got something that's just not gonna put on a ton of top growth, they don't need as much fertilizer. So yeah, just sort of depending on how vigorous and how large the plant is, we can use that to gauge how much food we want to give them. And then talk briefly on some other supplements. I mentioned micronutrients briefly. These are going to be your iron, zinc, manganese, molybdenum, copper. And a lot of fertilizers may have these added in already. And if it's a pot that's just going to be a year or so before it gets refreshed, it may not be a big deal. But a lot of these nutrients will deplete pretty quickly in the container, and adding a product like glacial dust or azomite. And then there are a few just micronutrient blends that are commercially available that can be worthwhile to add on a yearly basis, especially if it's a container that's not going to be replanted for several years. And then also adding our beneficial soil microbes can really be beneficial. A lot of people don't think in a container of adding these. We think that they really belong in the ground, but we found that they can increase drought tolerance, they can increase water retention in the soil, they can increase nutrient uptake, and then a lot of soil microbes can actually help prevent root disease that we run into if soil is staying too wet or waterlogged. And then I didn't add it to this slide, but I did want to briefly mention some plants definitely prefer a more acidic or more alkaline soil, and adding supplements to help adjust the pH for plants that specifically need either a more alkaline or acidic soil can definitely help. So unless we have any questions at this point on fertilizers, I'm going to move on to talking about watering and watering schedules. So most of our native plants are actually going to prefer fairly regular water, despite being what we would consider to be very drought tolerant when planted in the ground. How often regular is really depends on your weather, the type of plant, and the soil texture. I really like to use a more porous mix because it allows for regular watering during the warm months. while draining through and reducing the risk of root rot and other diseases that come along with keeping your plants too wet. So things to consider, definitely how vigorous the plant is. A plant that's actively growing is going to suck up more water. As I mentioned, I prefer really porous open mixes. So soils with those textures tend to dry a little bit more quickly, which means that they may need to get rewatered a little bit more quickly. But if there's enough airspace, we can actually keep the soil fairly damp without running into root rot issues that we would run into with a more of a standard potting mix. And then also in terms of what regular is, it's going to kind of depend on the season. And if we make it part of our routine to keep an eye on our plants and see when they're starting to show signs of wilting. So yeah, just keeping a closer eye on our plants will help ensure that we are not underwatering them. And then I did want to mention that drainage hole issue can be a big problem if soil is not draining through. If the water is staying waterlogged, we're going to get a couple different things happen. Creates a great opportunity for root diseases to set in. And if you're actually ending up with standing water in your container, it will literally drown the roots. If they cannot breathe, they will die. So if it looks like your soil is staying wet longer than normal, if you're noticing that you may have some pooling water after irrigating, double check those drain holes to make sure that they're not clogged by either some compacted soil or some roots that have made their way down there. And maintaining our containers, the best thing you can give your garden is your shadow. So if we are in our gardens regularly watching the plants, we'll just have a better understanding of when they're happy, what their needs are, and when we may need to change something to be sure that they're happy. In terms of repotting and refreshing your soil, this will depend quite a bit on the type of soil that you're using. The higher the organic material is, the quicker it's going to break down and start to compact. The higher the inorganic material is, typically the longer it's going to hold its structure before that starts to break down. Other thing to consider is how vigorous the plant is. Really vigorously growing plant is going to put out a lot of roots, and those are more likely to start to clog drain holes and get matted at the bottom of the pot. So yeah, more vigorous plant is going to need to be refreshed more often. And typically I would recommend removing the entire root ball from the container. We're typically going to start with cutting off or removing any of the matted roots at the bottom of the pot, and then loosening up the sides of the container to the sides of the root ball to loosen up any matted roots there, and just to shake out some of the old soil that's getting a little bit tired out. And then we will replace fresh soil underneath the pot, underneath the root ball. And then as we place it back in, we can refill around the sides. And then not going to spend a ton of time talking about pruning and deadheading. That's really going to depend on the plant specifically, and the timing of those things really varies depending on what plants we're growing. And then, yeah, and as we repot, we want to add fresh fertilizer when the plant goes back into the container to make sure it's off to a good, strong start with its fresh soil. And then depending on your goals, if we're looking to sort of maintain the size of a plant, we may want to put it back into the same pot after doing some root and top pruning. If it's something that we want to let get big and fabulous, we may want to shift it up to a larger container.
Some questions before we move on to the next topic.
Yeah.
When is the best time to repot natives? Ideally summer, fall, winter. I mean, depends, I guess, on the growth of the plant and if but
Yeah, it depends a lot on the growth of the plant. So in containers, we can really plant any time of the year, and we can refresh the soil mostly any time of the year. I would typically avoid the heat of summer. That can be a stressful time, especially if we're end up removing a decent portion of the plant's roots that have become matted at the bottom of the pot. And then I also tend to avoid the dead of winter when the plant is just going to sit in its new home without growing new roots on it. So I would say that spring and fall are the best. We always say that fall is the best time for planting native plants going into the ground. And I would say it's a little bit more, we're a little more forgiving in containers, whether you do spring or fall planting. Again, depends on when the plant is actively growing, but replanting ahead of an active growth season when we can get those roots to reestablish in the container is best. So that would be early to mid-spring, or late summer and early fall is also a great time to replant when we still have that little bit of fall growth flush before we really start to cool down going into winter.
great, thank you for that. And some questions about watering that are both kind of related, about using like a, like the slow feeding, like a wine bottle, or commercial products that provide slow steady water in containers. And then also, if you're on vacation, using granules that turn into a gel and hold water. What do you think of?
Yeah, so I think that like those the wine bottles, or the little clay stakes that slowly percolate water into the soil are great ways to go. They tend to keep the soil fairly evenly moist, and also cool thing about those products is as the soil dries out, the water will percolate more quickly through the device. So if the plant starts to dry out, water will actually flow a little bit more quickly from the vessel into the container. I'm personally not a huge fan of the polymer type products that retain water when wet. They don't really work well as a top dress. So is sort of like just like a temporary thing. They really work best when they're mixed in with the soil. And with our natives, I have found that sometimes they can start to eat up airspace and stay too wet. That's not to say that they can't be used. I would just mix them in fairly sparingly so that you do still have good airspace in the soil. And then a method that I often use is the tray method. Put your plant in a bowl or tray of water and fill that up, and that will typically give you enough moisture to get through a weekend, and is pretty easy to deal with. And I've actually found that if you're using a really porous mix, you can, even though we don't typically recommend keeping plants in trays of water, if the mix is pretty porous, you can actually get away with keeping a lot of natives actually in a shallow tray of water. And it's a great way to grow a lot of the ferns that typically will survive drying out, but will look pretty rough if they dry out even a single time. So yeah, those are a few ways to get through. Other thing is hose end timers are getting pretty cheap. And these you can set up to run about once a day, and not necessarily something that you use all the time, but could run out at a couple mister stakes to your potted plants to keep them going if you're away for vacation. So I think now we're gonna move into the fun part and talk about some of our favorite plants, and I'll try to move through these fairly quickly so we've got some more time for Q&A at the end. Um, But buckwheats are one of my personal favorites. Some of the smaller species are great for even some of your smaller containers. And then some of the shrub types are great for medium and larger containers. These are very heat tolerant, very drought tolerant, even in containers, and great that they give us some blooms even when a lot of other things aren't particularly showy. And here couple containers from East Bay Wilds in Oakland. They've got some fabulous container gardens there, and he's a good resource, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end too. Beard tongues are also fabulous showy perennials, typically spring and summer bloomers for containers in sun to part shade. We've got low-growing plants like this Penstemon proceris in this container here. Penstemon davidsonii and newberrii are also good sort of low spreading species. And then there are lots of upright growers, which can be super showy centerpieces in larger containers. And Palmeri and Centranthiflorus are a couple of my favorites there. Lewisia or bitterroots are fabulous, very showy succulents. Lewisia cotyledon and longipetala will both stay evergreen with summer water. A lot of other native species will go summer dormant, but they're great as accents in mixed pots or are a great statement on their own in a small container. And here's a few more. Lewisia cotyledon in bloom, just super showy. Another succulent favorite are the Dudleas or Live Forevers. These are fortunately becoming a lot more available in the nursery trade. Quite a few species are pretty regularly available these days. Some of the dwarf species are great for tabletop displays, and then some of the larger species like the chalk Dudleas are just super showy in a large container. And do want to watch out, even with a porous soil, some of the desert species are very intolerant of summer water. I actually knocked one of mine out by giving it a little too much water when we got hot this summer, which was unfortunate, but fabulous plants. And then another succulent, the sedums or stone crops, great low growing rambling succulents and great to soften the edge of a mixed pot or great in their own small planter on their own. Hot summer climates best with a little bit of afternoon shade. And I am very jealous of all you gardening in coastal areas where you can grow your sedums in full sun, because some of them just get awesome foliage color, really nice reds and purples and grays if you're able to grow them in full sun. Ferns are also fabulous in containers, need a shady spot and best in well-drained soil and best to keep them fairly moist. As I mentioned before, I like to keep my ferns in a tray of water to help keep them from drying out. And then maidenhair ferns can actually be used as a house plant, and they're great in smaller medium containers. And then deer ferns, sword ferns, lady ferns, chain ferns, and several other ferns all are super showy in medium and large containers. Coyote mints are great showy perennials. They're awesome pollinator attractors. And then they also have just a great minty herbal aroma to them. And these tend to be sort of low growing or spreading perennials. So great on the edge of a large container or on their own in a medium or smaller container. This picture is Monardella villosa, I believe, which is your sort of typical form, but then there's also Monardella macrantha, great spreading ground cover with these larger showy red flowers, but fabulous plant and one of my favorites. Humboldt lilies. I know this is one that was featured in the emails for this presentation, so I figured I'd better touch on this. They're super showy plants, and these are opposed to our leopard lilies. These are dryland lilies, so chaparral and oak woodland habitats. and they need to go dry during the summer. But these are great with regular water and feeding when they're actively growing and blooming. But I would recommend as the flowers start to fade that we start with holding water. And once the foliage starts to yellow out, it's best to let the plants dry up a little bit going through the summer months. The heuchera or alum roots are fabulous container plants for shady gardens. There's quite a few species and varieties available. Some of the larger growing types like heuchera maxima is great for a larger pot. And then I believe that this picture is Canyon Duet, which is a native hybrid from Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens and is great just because it's a really compact grower, really heavy bloomer. Just a great showy plant for a spot that gets some afternoon shade. And bulbs are great in containers. A lot of bulbs can be challenging in the ground because they really like to go dry in the summer, and a lot of our standard plantings may get some regular water. So in a container, we can tuck the pots into a dry, out of the way spot once they've started to go dormant. But a lot of species will handle some summer water, and especially in mixed containers with succulents and dudleas and things like that, they can be a great accent just to add a little bit of spring color. And as long as the soil's pretty porous, they will handle some summer water as long as we're not keeping them sopping wet. But yeah, fawn lilies, calochordus, all of those fun things make great container specimens. And for most people growing them, they find that it's a little bit easier to grow in a pot where we can control the moisture a little bit more than we sometimes can in the ground. And then annuals are also great for containers. They can also be used as an accent to add some seasonal color to our other mixed pots, can make a great display on their own. And then one of my personal favorite pairings is sky lupin, that nice blue compared to the bright orange of the California poppies, but can make for a super showy patio display. And we can grow California natives as houseplants too. This is a piggyback plant or Tolmia, so kind of classic houseplant that happens to be a California native. Have had good luck with some of the maidenhair ferns. And then I have seen people growing some of the coastal dudleas as houseplants also. And it would be fun to play with more. Anything that is more coastal, so doesn't have as sharp of a seasonal change, that is used to a little bit lower light, would definitely be worthwhile trying as a house plant. And then we've got a few resources here from the California Native Plant Society, Calscape, Bloom, California. And then we've also linked a gardening article on patio and container gardening by Pete Valou of East Bay Wilds Nursery in Oakland, who a lot of the pictures in this presentation have been featured from.
Awesome. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm going to ask some questions that folks had. Can we talk about pot selection? I know you said that any container is okay, but there's opinions about toxicity in certain materials of pots, or glaze versus unglaze, or plastic versus wood. Curious what your thoughts are about the material that you choose for your pots.
We want to watch out for treated wood products, can have some toxicity in them. A lot of pressure treated wood will have copper in them, which can be bad for root growth. And then personally, oh boy, really anything will do. Glazed ceramic and terracotta are probably my personal favorites. One, I have I hate to admit it, but I have a lot of my plants are just in regular black nursery pots. It is maybe not the most ideal. They tend to heat up a little bit more quickly and transmit more heat to the root ball than either a glazed ceramic or a terracotta, but they work perfectly well. And then if we cache pot them inside another pot, that really reduces the issues with them heating up. In some climates, that may be an advantage too. I mean, in coastal areas where we may want a little bit more heat to absorb into the root ball. Yeah, those darker containers can be great. I think that glazed ceramics probably absorb and transfer a little bit more heat to the root system than terracotta does. But I personally haven't had any issues with them overheating. I have used metal containers as well. These will also absorb quite a bit of heat, but as long as we're keeping up with irrigation, really any container can do. I think that yeah, terracotta is probably gonna out of all of the options breathe the best and potentially stay cooler than any of the other options. But yeah, as long as we're not picking something that's going to have something in it that's detrimental to the plant in terms of being toxic, can really get away with any type container. And happy to answer any more specific questions along those lines.
Yeah. Can we talk about mulching a bit? And also, yeah, we didn't mention also if we have time talking about, manzanita and coffeeberry and this larger shrubs and containers. I'm growing a Dr. Hurd manzanita in San Francisco and it's super happy. I've had it for a while. But yeah, if we have time.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we didn't cover much for shrubs here. Let me go over top dressing and mulching real quick. I think it is probably less of a concern in a container than it is in the ground. Container's going to dry out anyway, whether it's mulched or not. I definitely think that adding a mulch layer will help keep the surface layer and the roots a little bit cooler and will help with evaporation somewhat, but I think it's a little bit less critical than in the ground. For a container, I would say pick your top dressing more for aesthetics than for functionality. I like to use a lot of crushed rock products, and then also to mix in some larger rocks or pieces of wood as well. So yeah, some of the benefits of mulching that we see in the ground are lost a little bit in containers just because they're going to dry out anyway. And then as for growing coffee berries, ceanothus, arctostaphylos in containers, all of those can be great options. I've seen some gorgeous planters with the manzanitas in them. And then we've got, it comes down to, for a lot of the larger shrubs, maintenance and what your goal is. So we can either continually every few years pot these up into larger containers to let the plant grow larger. But if space is limited, we may have to start doing um, some techniques to sort of pseudo bonsai these plants so that they can maintain themselves in a larger container. And to do this, when we replant the pot, if we're planning on trying to slow down the growth of the plant so we can keep it in a certain sized container for the long run. When we replant, we may prune the roots a little bit more heavily. The top growth and the root system of the plants are kind of tied to each other. So if we reduce the root mass, we're also going to reduce the plant's ability to put on top growth. So we can actually prune the roots back a little bit more heavily. And then also prune back the top of the plant to sort of balance the root system. And that will work for ceanothus, coffeeberry, manzanita, any of those larger shrubs. And then we can also pick slower growing or varieties that aren't anticipated to get quite as large. And that will just make it a little bit easier to maintain them in the long run in a container.
Great, thank you for that. Let's see. For transplanting, do you moisten the soil before changing the pots, or do you transplant when they're dry? Um,
So I think it's always best to water your plants before you remove them from the container. Once we have removed them from the pot, if they are dry, it can be harder to get the soil to rehydrate. So yeah, I would recommend watering your containers before you remove the plants to do any root pruning or refreshing of the soil.
Great. And I know you mentioned trays of water. Some folks were asking about the risk with mosquitoes. Do you just like wash it out every few days or make sure there's no standing water for too long?
So a couple different techniques there. Typically, if you are using a tray, it's best to let it dry out in between, and that will mitigate the mosquito issue right off the bat. But if it's something that you are intending to keep water in the tray, for example, for some ferns, or if you're growing some of our California native carnivorous plants like some of the sundunes or Darlingtonia that need to be in standing water, you can either, yeah, fully wash it out when you irrigate so that any larva or eggs get flushed out. Another great way is you can use Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacteria that produces a chemical that prevents the larval form of mosquitoes from maturing. So that's something that you can just add to the tray, and it comes in a liquid or in a little shaker can of little bits that you can shake into your trays. So yeah, I use BT products to prevent mosquitoes in areas where I have standing water.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I'm just looking through we still have 2 more minutes left. Any tips for growing incense cedar in a container? It's kind of a cool question.
Yeah, so incense cedar was great in a container. They tend to be a fairly slow growing conifer, so it's not going to need to be repotted or refreshed super often. But yeah, I would say, I mean, a pretty standard soil mix. They're fairly drought tolerant in a container, so that's one that I would probably lean a little bit more towards letting dry out. Although I have had some people say that incense cedars are very tolerant of water too. And then really depends on your goal for the plant. I have seen them trained into bonsai specimens, which could be super cool. But they can also be great in a larger container, and um, and they can take shearing too. So to keep that sort of nice, dense, sort of Christmas tree style growth, instead of going through and thinning out the branches, you can just sort of shear back the tips to maintain the size. But yeah.
Awesome, thank you for that. Let's see. I feel like that's kind of most of the questions. Someone asked about builder sand being good in soil mix. I know, kind of getting specific here, but
Oh, sand is tricky. I would really recommend getting something that's labeled as horticultural sand. A lot of the other types of sand tend to compact down more than I like. So yeah, I would recommend just buying a bagged sand product from the nursery as opposed to going to the rock yard and getting one of their sand products. I actually had some leftover pool filter sand that looked really nice and clean, and I thought it would be great for a little desert planter that I was doing, and it ended up being way too dense and just retained a ton more moisture than I had anticipated, and I ended up losing quite a few of the plants because even though it looked like the top of the soil was drying out, down in there, the sand was actually retaining a ton of moisture just because it was a lot finer, I think, than would be best for a container.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, oh yeah, keep going.
Oh, I just want to talk real quickly on plant sources. I want to shout out to everybody to shop at your local CNPS chapter plant sales and support your local independent native plant growers. I mentioned these in particular just because they tend to have kind of a unique selection, and have a lot of kind of specialty small nooks and cranny plants that can be a lot of fun for containers. And then did want to mention that a lot of plants are hard to find as plants start. So there's some great seed sources out there and can be a great way to find plants that you are unable to find in the nursery trade. And happy to answer any more questions if there are any.
Yeah, I think we're at our time and this is recorded, so you all can, use this as a reference and we'll send out a follow-up with the recording and other resources. So thanks so much, Brendan. That was a great presentation and I learned a lot and I hope you all did too. So,
Yeah,
take
thank you all for
care.
joining. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Take care. Have a good rest of your evening, everyone. Bye.